play, the school play, or you were downtown and did the play, or you were in the musical somewhere and you worked for months and months, and you strived, and maybe you're the one that made costumes and sewed on those, or maybe you were the one who did the memory work, or you worked with someone else, or whatever it was that you did. All of this work, all of this timing, all the months and months of work came together, and then finally the time for the curtain to open, and the person says, action. That's what we're going to talk about today. We do a lot of preparation in our lives. We do a lot of things. We've been talking for several weeks now about some of the background parts of, or the background to our evangelism and how that, what it looks like. And so today we're going to talk about the action of it. We're going to talk about how Christ demonstrated His life and how that affects us. So in this chapter, or in this time today, we're going to talk about the overt actions that we do in leading people, talking to them about Christ and what that looks like. So the key, I think, is to look at what it must always look like in Jesus, okay? Jesus was the unveiling of God, right? We realize that he was the complete revelation of God, complete revelation of what God looks like in total. So there is no God behind Jesus that's different from what Jesus was like when He was here. God didn't have this 3/4 or 2/3 of something and only 1/3 showed up, and everything else is a mystery. What we see in Jesus is who God was, who God is. And so I want us to think about that as we consider who we're going to be and what we are going to look like. In John 13, we read a story about Jesus washing the feet of His disciples. Probably during the Lenten season, we'll probably look at that again a lot closer. But just as we look at that story, it says Jesus bent down. Okay, remember, this is God come to earth, right? The creator of the universe. And it says He bent down like a slave to wash the feet of His disciples. And when He got to Peter, Peter was repulsed because Peter could not understand the idea that the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, the one who would become the king, the one who would be the ruler of the mighty nation they hoped to have, would be doing the act of a slave. It made absolutely no sense to him at all. It's not how the Messiah was supposed to act, much less one who claimed to be God. Matter of fact, I don't think Peter really wanted a God who served. You know, the idea was that God was one who ruled over others. But if God ruled over others, then that meant the top followers of God could rule also, right? They were in control. They were doing it. They knew what they were doing. They were right there up there with God. But if God takes the lowest role in serving, serves in the least, the lowest manner, then those that follow Him must be, at least should in some degree, follow and reflect that same attitude. So Jesus demonstrated that the truth of God is revealed through service. And in doing so, He flipped some common assumptions about power and control and authority, and it's kind of messed up the world. But I want us to read for a minute. The scripture today is the passage we'll look at. It's on this. Will be on the screen in just a second. Here is from Matthew, where Jesus is talking to the religious leaders, because this is the time He's trying to show His disciples how they need to be followers, or what they need to do to be followers of Him. And what they're seeing from all the religious leaders is something totally different than what He's showing them. And so let's see what Jesus has to say about the religious followers of the day. We're in Matthew chapter 23, verses 4 and 5, and then we'll go down to verses 27 and 28. I encourage you to take the whole chapter and read the whole chapter. There's some real value in reading that whole chapter if you'll take time to do that. This is what Jesus says about the religious leaders. He says, "For they tie together heavy packs that are impossible to carry. Rules and guidelines that are so much that it doesn't matter what you do, you're breaking a rule or a law, right? So heavy that they're impossible to carry. They put them on the shoulders of others, tell others they have to do this, but they're unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They're not going to help in any way, shape, or form. Everything they do to be noticed by others." And then go down to verse 27. He says, "How terrible it would be for you legal experts and Pharisees. Hypocrites," he says. "You are all like whitewashed tombs. They look beautiful on the outside, but inside they are full of dead bones and all kinds of filth. In the same way, you look righteous to people, but inside you are full of pretense and rebellion." Jesus had a different opinion of what it meant to be someone that you could follow than the other religious leaders did of the day. Jesus revealed that the truth of God is revealed through service. And so what he showed us was that serving people as he lived with them has the power to open doors and change. Now, what the religious leaders and what our leaders today often think is the way to gain power over people is to have control, to be able to be the one who controls others. That's the power, right? And so Jesus flips this upside down, and he's saying that when we serve people, that gives us power. He says it has a power to make a way for the truth about Jesus if we serve others. Jesus told the disciples, he said, "Wash feet. Wash each other's feet," he said. Now remember, this is the job of the lowliest slave. The lowest person has to do that. He said, "Wash each other's feet." And then he says, "I give you another command. Love one another. As I've loved you, you must love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, or that you are Jesus' followers, if you love one another." So in other words, the way the world will know that they're followers of Jesus is through the way they serve one another. The way we serve each other in the church is a sign to the world of who God is. The way we fight with each other in the church is a different sign. We'll save that for a different day. But how we serve each other is a sign to the world. So let me ask you a question, give you something to think about. Have you been influenced by someone who was really good at serving, who served and just did things? I bet every single one of us knows someone who was, maybe they were quiet, maybe they were behind the scenes, but they made a difference in our lives because we watched them serve. No matter what came up, no matter what happened, they served and they did for others. And here's something else I would guess probably. You probably respect a person like that a lot more than you respect somebody who talks a lot, right? And says they do things, but they don't do them as much. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying that having the servant's heart, or let me rephrase this, for us to have the servant's heart of Jesus is not something that we can turn on or off. Okay? Now, it's common, I think, for people to think of serving in this way, that it's a spiritual thing that we do. And so when we're involved in spiritual activities like church programs, right, we serve. Our small groups where we serve to do communion, we serve to do take the offering, and we have different ones that I love so much. Their service in the back, working the coffee bar and all those things. It's great, but we think about that, or we may think about when we go on a VIM trip, mission trip, then we put on our service uniform and we serve. But then when we get back to secular activities, that requires us to think differently, because you can't climb the ladder of success unless you act in the proper way and do the right things and make the right control the right things. Because a servant might not go up the ladder as well, right? But that's not the way the message of Jesus works. Paul wrote these words. Think about this. He wrote these words to indentured servants. Now, if you don't know what an indentured servant is, it's a slave. That until a debt has been paid off, they have no freedom at all. Zero. Their life is totally controlled. And most of the people who would put people in become indentured servants, worked it out so they would have them the entire lives. Okay? And so this is who Jesus is talking to in this time. He's talking to them, and he tells them this. That's who, Paul. I'm talking about Paul rather than Jesus. In the first century, he tells them this. He says, work, and this is in Colossians 3 if you want to look it up. He says, work willingly in whatever you do as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an eternal inheritance as your reward, and that the boss you are serving is Jesus Christ. We say, although they were mistreated by their owners, they were to serve them anyway, just as if they were working for the Lord. They were to serve them in the work like Jesus served his disciples. Here's the people that were going to betray him, and he was washing their feet. So today, for us, this might mean that in our jobs, if we have not retired yet and we're still working, this would mean in our jobs, or if in school, if we're in high school or college, it would mean in our classes, and if we have jobs on the side, that we do them like we're doing it for God, for the Lord. We share the gospel through the faithful service that we give our vocations. Whatever it is, we're faithful in that. People see that. So we don't turn on and off the call to serve. It's not just we come and we're going to do an annual mission trip, or we're going to do once a month we're going to do whatever. That's not real. That's not all the service that is required of us. But we have this call continually to reflect the life of Christ. Here's the thing about serving. Serving, serving applies to our relationships, right? It applies to people inside the church, but also applies to people outside of the church. As we wash each other's feet by serving each other, we're empowered to wash the feet of the world. And God came in Jesus by expressing his love through the actions of serving, and it culminated on the cross. I mean, the pinnacle of service was him giving his life. Jesus expressed the meaning of God's gospel through the actions on the cross. That was it's the best you can get of serving others. The extreme. But here's what Jesus said as he was doing these things, as he was serving. He says, no servant is greater than their master. And no messenger is greater than the one who sent the messenger. And so Jesus says these words immediately after he washes his disciples' feet, a job that none of them would do. And he says, hey, you're not any greater than this. You really need to look and learn and serve. So I think what we are invited to, we're invited to share the love of Jesus by serving others. I think that's evangelism. I think that's part of who we need to be in our inviting others to join the journey that starts by our serving others. So for some, this action is significant and obvious. In our family we have I have an adopted granddaughter, and I just can't imagine what that little girl's life would have been like if our daughter wouldn't have adopted. And I tell you, because our daughter and ex-son-in-law decided to adopt and give such a wonderful life to this little girl, I could even still stand my ex-son-in-law a little bit just honesty. So there's some ways that we can serve others. That's awesome ways, and it really shows up. Maybe we. My dad was okay. My dad was pretty big on inviting homeless people into the house. My mom was not. The conversations around our dinner table became quite interesting from time to time. But there are ways that we can serve. These are some ways. There are a lot of different ways. Our actions don't have to be quite so obvious. But our actions may come in the form of seeing a neighbor outside and we talk to them across the fence or whatever, and just, they may need to talk, and maybe it's listening. Or maybe it's going for a walk with a neighbor because they're having a hard time, and you just sit and you just walk, and you spend enough time during this walk, 30, 45-minute walk, that they get past the and ahs, and they actually just share from their heart something that they really needed to share. It could be finding a creative way to serve a coworker or a boss that's beyond what's required by your job. The last church, we had one family that would go to one of the apartment complexes that wasn't too far away, and would play, have a soccer ball, and they would take and just come play soccer with kids, and they would have little snacks and stuff, and the kids would eat. I don't know if today if parents would let them do that, but for some of those kids, that was, in the afternoon, that was the first food they'd had for the day. And so there are ways that we can find to serve others and help people in a sometimes harsh and cruel world. There are a variety of ways that we can serve others to demonstrate the love of Christ in tangible ways. Here's an idea, and I told you from the top when we started this series that it wasn't going to be a deep theological treatise. We were just going to look at some practical things, and we've been very true to that. We've been just talking about normal ideas. Maybe one of the simplest things that we can do is invite other person or persons or family to our home and have dinner with them, sit down over a meal, and just talk, just visit. And I know that inviting people into your house is kind of like weddings. Used to, you could have a wedding and have a cake and some punch, and you were good, and now you got to have a meal and destinations and all these things. And it's become miserable to go through something that was meant to be awesome for some. But I know in inviting somebody over, we have to have the housekeeper, some kind of a house cleaner come and clean up the house, and we have to do all these things. Or we have to prepare the most spectacular meal of the year. But maybe if we were just who we were, and we just invite somebody over, you could even order in, right? So order something in, and it's not really about the food. It's not about how clean or straight your house is. It's really about sharing your life with someone else. I think when our lives become so complex that we try to make everything an impressive event, and I think that takes away sometimes from the enjoyment of getting together with other people and sharing one-on-one with them. So in our world today, there are a lot who are quite skeptical about the Christian message, honestly. Maybe some people were hurt by a church in their past. A lot of that has happened. More than a few people have given up on God and walked away from their faith because it seemed irrelevant. Some have walked away because they don't understand the pain and the misery in the world. All-loving God who can control and fix everything. There are a lot of reasons. And we have this multicultural thing going on right now, right? I mean, who knows where anybody's coming from. We have so many cultures just even in our within a square mile of where we're at. here in the church building. You see, in previous generations, it was easier, right? Some of you that are older, you remember how it was. You could go to church, everybody kind of shared a common understanding of what church and God was, and so we could give this proactive message of God and preaching of the message of gospel, and a lot of times it would bring conviction, and there was this quick transformation. Pearson would come to the front, and we'd welcome them into the church, but now it's so much different. The context is so different. It's much more likely that people will be open to our message about Christ if they see the life of Christ in action first in our society. Peter wrote to his churches, he said this, he said, always be prepared to give an answer. And the reason he said this was because what happens when we serve is serving often leads to conversation. Go on a mission trip. Go to the lighthouse and serve. Go to Tuesday House and serve. Wherever it is that you serve, go and do that. And I promise you it's going to lead to conversation. And so Peter says, always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. But then he says, do it with gentleness and respect. And it's not because he was trying to develop an evangelism program. That wasn't Peter's idea. Instead, he wanted them to live in a distinctive way that they would be ready to respond when people asked them why they lived the way they did. In other words, our actions of service serve as prompters to start conversations about Jesus. Steve Sjogren has written several books about what he calls servant evangelism. And the point, he says, is that we serve people where no strings are attached. We don't ask for anything in return. But he has found, as well as we're talking about, that a lot of times acts of service strike up conversations. And so he says this. He says, when someone close to you asks you why you're going out of your way to serve him or her, there are a lot of different ways to give God the credit. He says, you might say something like, it's just my small way of showing you how much God loves you. Or, you looked like you could use some encouragement, and I thought if Jesus were here, it might be what he would do. The basic message, he goes on to say, he said, the basic message is you're so important to God and to me that we can't help but show that to you every once in a while. Wow. I'll repeat this line he said. The basic message is you're so important to God and to me that we can't help trying to show you that every once in a while. And then he continues, though it might sound a little odd the first few times it comes out of your mouth, it's something everyone needs to hear. In our experience, most people, even those hostile to organized religion, appreciate the idea that God thinks they're worthy of special treatment. Consider that. Let me read that one more time. In our experience, most people, even though hostile to organized religion, appreciate the idea that God thinks they're worthy of special treatment. And so we can help people and we can evangelize by serving. But here's kind of the issue that we get into sometimes. Now, I was raised in the Assemblies of God. I don't know if we have any other Assemblies of God people here who raised that, but I was raised in the Assemblies of God, and I've mentioned before that we were pretty sure that we were pretty close to having it right. We had this box that we were in, and there were Baptists, and the Baptists were pretty good, but they were missing some things. They kind of smoked outside their church and things. And there were Methodists who really didn't have a clue. And then you had the Presbyterian, and they were, so busy being high church that they didn't have time to be real Christian. And then there were Catholics that forgot about Jesus and just focused on Mary, we thought. And so we were really confused by them. And so what we had, and then you had this other group of people who were just mess-ups that weren't church people at all. They were just mess-ups in life. They were a group of people that you gave up on. A group of people that didn't even try to be good Christians, didn't even try to look the part. And so here we were in our Assembly of God box, and we were loving Jesus, and we were called to save the world. You know, the other churches we weren't too concerned about. This mess-up box we were pretty concerned about. And so if one of them would kind of sneak out of there and come over here and try to get in our box with us, then we would, because since we were called to get them saved, then we would actually, if they would follow some rules, would let them in our box with us. You know, I remember the first time I looked at a membership card to sign. It said, you cannot drink alcohol. I didn't drink alcohol, it was a big issue. You can't smoke tobacco. Okay, I'll quit. I didn't do it. I never inhaled. You can't go to movies. What? And the list went on. And the dumbest thing was I signed the card. I signed the card. Because I wanted in the box, because I thought this was a box I was supposed to be in. Because somehow in my mind and their minds, we thought this was what being Christian was, and this was the right thing. And so here's the thing. We were all this box, and whatever box you were raised in and where you're in, whether it was a Methodist box, a Baptist box, a Catholic box, whatever it is, we were in that box, and we were there, and we were thinking we were good. And we all have noticed the screw-up box. I mean, the mess-up box. I wasn't going to say that. The mess-up box, right? We all noticed that. Mess-up box. But you know what? When I started reading through the passages of Scripture, you know what? Jesus lived his life in the mess-up box. This is where Jesus lived. Matter of fact, Jesus said, I didn't come for the righteous. I would say self-righteous. I came for the sinner. And so while we, the church people, were over here trying to make sure everybody fit in our little box to be like we are, Jesus is over here in the mess-up box, talking to people, building relationship with people, welcoming people, sharing love, kindness, serving, giving. And we're over here a little too good for them. Because once we put this box around us and decided what all those rules and guidelines, we're judging them because they're not like us, right? Isn't that what we do? You know what? We need to get rid of that box because every one of us, every single one of us, is a mess up. Matter of fact, some of you hate this, but I'm going to ask you to do it. Look at your neighbor and tell him you are a mess up. Okay, I got one more thing for you to tell him, though. One more thing. Here's the second part. Here's the second part. I am a mess up. Tell him that. I'm a mess up. You see, Jesus lived in this realm so much that when he called his disciples, he called a whole bunch of mess-ups. Matter of fact, he called a guy that would eventually cause his death. He lived with this guy. He called this guy to be one of his closest friends, a guy that would totally deny that he existed, that he thought about him, cared about him, loved him, or anything, in front of everybody he could find to deny him in front of. I'm saddened sometimes that we as a church, I'm not talking about East Cross, I'm not talking about United Methodist, I'm talking about Christian people. We as a church, we start finding God's love. We start finding out that God thinks that we're special. If we start receiving that love, and we start accepting that love, and we start changing our lives because God helps us do that, and we start looking for a box to get in instead of staying right here and serving the other mess ups.